Hello everyone, and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more exciting content. Today we'll be taking a look at the infamous Gooch Close Gang of Manchester. The Gooch Close Gang, also known as the GCOGs, Gooch Close Original Gangsters, or simply the Gooch in Manchester, was an organised crime group based in Moss Side and surrounding neighbourhoods of South Manchester, England. Most members of the gang grew up on the west side of Alexandra Park Estate in Moss Side around Gooch Close, which is where the gang gets its name. The Gooch is part of an alliance of Crip gangs which has had violent disputes with many other South Manchester gangs, most notably the Doddington Gang, formerly known as the Pepperhill Mob, the Moss Side Bloods and the Longsight Crew. The Gooch Gang has its origins in the west side of the Alexandra Park Estate in Moss Side. Young men would hang around a shebeen on Gooch Close selling drugs, which is where the gang started and how they got their name. A shebeen is just another place for an establishment or a private house that sells alcohol and is usually unlicensed. Gooch Close was a small cul-de-sac of semi-detached houses with an alley at one end. In the mid-1990s, the Alexandra Park Estate was redeveloped and the street was redesigned and had its name changed to Westerling Way. The gangs, while supplying to the street dealers, also tried to ensure that the dealers were protected from other gangs by protecting their territory. Most of their problems occurred when rival street dealers started to move into the territory already controlled by a gang, or when a gang taxed a rival dealer. A move seen as damaging street credibility and respect. The gangs in South Manchester, including the Gooch Gang, were made up of mostly first and second generation British, West Indies, Caribbean heritage members, whose grandparents came to England from the 1950s. Around the same time as the Gooch Gang Close was becoming known around the city, the Pepperhill Gang were also starting to emerge, taking their name from a pub on the east side of the Alexandra Park Estate. When the pub closed down and the gang targeted by police, they reformed around nearby Doddington Close and would go on to become known as the Doddington Gang. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Pepperhill Gang were involved in a gang war between Moss Side and the Cheetham Hill Gang from North Manchester. The Gooch often brought and sold drugs with the Cheetham Hill Gang. The Gooch had close ties to Cheetham Hill, with the cousin of Cheetham Hill head being a leading figure in the Gooch. The Pepperhill Gang thought this was a helping the enemy kind of thing, and the Pepperhill Gang declared that nobody from South Manchester was to have dealings with Cheetham Hill anymore. This angered the Gooch and a fierce war erupted, dividing the Alexandra Park Estate in half, with the Gooch on the west side and the Pepperhill on the east side, although the gang war was centred around Moss Side. Young males from neighbouring areas would be drawn into the conflict, resulting in a number of deaths and regular shooting incidents in South Manchester through the 1990s and 2000s. In 1996, an offshoot gang was identified, Young Gooch, which contained a frightening reputation for the violence and guns its members used. 5 of its members were later arrested following Operation Eagle and were sentenced to more than 43 years in prison. The Young Gooch started to war with the newly emerging Longsight Crew, a younger offshoot of the Doddington Gang, whose members were based on a number of estates in the Longsight and Ardwick areas of South Manchester, especially their headquarters of Langport Avenue. By the mid-2000s, the Gooch had grown to become a vast gang made up of a number of smaller offshoots crews, based around South Manchester. The most notable of these being the Longsight Street Soldiers, or the Old Trafford Crips, or the Rush Home Crips, and Fallowfield Mad Dogs. These gangs would carry out on the rivalry with Doddington and Longsight Crew in the 2000s. It's also notable that most gangs that roam the streets of the UK today are offshoots from these revolutionary gangs. Ten members of the South Manchester's Gooch Gang were put on a trial in October 2008 for a catalogue of gang-related crimes. Gang members Mr Colin, Joyce and Mr Amos had been arrested in 2000 when they had been apprehended at their nerve centre in a house in Moss Side, found with an extraordinary array of firearms. In 2001 they had been sentenced to 9 years in prison, but had been released early on licence in 2007, and there had been followed out a new bout of shootings after. In April 2009, Mr Joyce and Mr Amos were among 11 members of the Gooch Gang who were found guilty and charged with a catalogue of crimes, which included the murder of Mr Ucal Chin, Mr Tyrone Gilbert, which we'll be taking a closer look at in a little bit. These convictions were hailed by Manchester's chief prosecutor John Holt as having enormous significance for the public safety. Their trials were held 35 miles away at Liverpool Crown Court to lower the risk of witness intimidation from other gang members. Not unusually, the perpetrators of gun crime were also the victims, with Mr Amos's brother Mr Stephen Babatunde Amos having been shot dead in a gang-related shooting aged 21 outside a bar in Ashton-under-Lyne in 2002. Mr Colin Joyce, aged 29, known as the leader of the gang, was given a minimum 39-year sentence. Mr Lee Amos was sentenced to receive at least 35 years. 3 other members of the gang were given minimum sentences of between 30 and 35 years. 11 members of the Gooch Gang were found guilty of charges ranging from murder and gun possession to drug dealing in 2009. Since their arrest, gang-related shootings in Manchester have fallen by a massive 92%, and there have been no gang-related murders for a year. Gang leaders Mr Colin Joyce and Mr Lee Amos were convicted of the drive-by killing of a mourner at the funeral of a man who had been executed months earlier. Mr Joyce, who called himself the General, had left a trail of mayhem across Manchester as his gang tortured and attacked rivals. It culminated in the murders of Mr Ucal Chin, and then aged 24, and Mr Tyrone Gilbert, then aged 23, linked to the rival Longsight crew. Detective Chief Inspector Stephen Eckersley said, "I'm absolutely delighted that the members of this ruthless gang are off the streets. They were prepared to use deadly violence to enforce their will and settle scores with their rivals. The implications of their conviction for this entire city are immense." All 11 gang members have now been found guilty at Liverpool Crown Court of 26 out of 27 charges, ranging from murder and gun possession to drug dealing. Mr Joyce, whose trouser pockets were specially adapted to act as gun holsters, led the Gooch Gang in dealing drugs, torturing street dealers who crossed them, and targeting rivals. Gang warfare erupted in the city in 2007 after the pair were released on licence from a jail for firearms offences. On June 15th, Mr Chin was driving around in South Manchester when he was ambushed by killers in a silver Audi who blasted him 7 times with a converted Russian Ucal pistol. 6 weeks after Mr Chin's death on July 27th, father of 3 Mr Tyrone Gilbert attended the funeral and the wake and continued at Mr Ucal's family home in Frobisher Close, Longsight. Shortly before midnight, the Gooch Gang drove past in a Honda Legend, closely followed by a blue Audi and another silver car. The gathering of around 80 mourners was sprayed with gunfire from a Smith & Wesson and a Dirty Harry style Magnum revolver and a 9mm semi-automatic machine gun. Mr Gilbert was killed by a single bullet to the chest. Also in the dock during the 6-month-long period, £5 million trial was Mr Narada Williams, also known as Yardy, and his brother Mr Ricardo, Mr Hassan Shah and Mr Areen Campbell. Mr Chin was shot in June 2007 as tensions reignited between the Longsight crew and the Gooch Gang. Mr Ucal's family has always denied that he was a gang member, but he did have a known Longsight crew member in the car with him on the day he was ambushed on Anson Road, Longsight. The victim of the 5th drive-by shooting that week in Manchester. It is unlikely that Ucal was spotted by chance by Mr Joyce and Mr Amos while they were out cruising in the area. Weeks before his death, he became father to a baby girl, described by loved ones as a loving, caring boy with no enemies. He was studying at college in the hope of becoming an engineer. His funeral was attended by scores of people, and because of the nature of his death, the service and the West Indian Centre wake that followed were given police protection. After the official celebrations, an impromptu wake was held near Ucal's family home. The gunmen, who probably employed spotters to track the movement of mourners, targeted this, knowing Longsight crew members were likely to be there. Mr Tyrone Gilbert was a Longsight crew member trying to change his ways at the time of his death. By the age of 23, the gang lifestyle meant he had already been touched by more tragedy than most people experience in a lifetime. His brother, Mr. Marcus Greenidge, was gunned down by the Pitbull crew in 2000, and he was with Mr. Fabian Flowers, 19, who was killed after a key fob gun went off in Stockport nightclub on a fatal night in 2005. 2 years earlier, Mr. Tyrone had enrolled on a course aimed at helping young adults take back into education, and after serving a sentence for a fray and a showdown between Longsight crew and the Gooch Gang at Manchester Royal Infirmary, he renewed efforts to change his ways in 2007. After he was murdered while attending his friend's wake, Mr. Tyrone had been avoiding old haunts and had only returned to the Grove village estate for the funeral. But in the weeks before Mr. Tyrone was killed, Mr. Narada Williams of the Gooch Gang was seen asking around for him, apparently with bad intentions in mind. In a tragic twist, Mr. Tyrone ended up being the victim of indiscriminate shooting after the Gooch Gang opened fire on the mourners near Mr. Ucal's family home in July 2007. Now an investigation under the Proceeds of Crime Act will try to work out what senior members did with the money they made drug dealing, trading in guns and acting as underworld fixers. Among the convicted men was self-styled General Mr. Colin Joyce, the gang leader, who has spent most of his last decade in prison. He is believed to have amassed a large amount of money from being a gangland armourer during the periods of freedom. Officers will now try to establish if he has invested the proceeds in carefully concealed business interests. The defendants also included Mr. Narada Williams of Fallowfield and Mr. Ricardo Williams of Moston. The brothers were said at their Liverpool Crown Court trial to have made up to £2,000 a day selling drugs. Their enterprise stretched from nightclubs to street corner deals, and even involved throwovers where drugs were hurled in modified tennis balls over prison walls. Despite this, officers investigating them before Liverpool Crown Court trial were unable to find much evidence of high living beyond the taste of hire cars and gold jewellery. A Proceeds of Crime investigation is expected to start shortly, which will establish if the money was frittered away and invested back into crime or laundered into legitimate businesses. Detective Chief Superintendent Steve Haywood, head of GMP's Serious Crime Division, said, "We have invested heavily in seizure teams, and all our major investigations are subject to a Proceeds of Crime Act cash and asset survey to determine whether any assets have been attained by illegal means. A lot of our more serious criminals find it very easy to do the time. They find it really difficult if you then take the house off them or their wife and kids, because they got that by criminal means. Investigations into organised crime gangs, whose main purpose is wealth creation, tend to be easier. Some of our South Manchester gangs are based on power and kudos, not necessarily wealth." Recent news on the Gooch Gang. Armed police swooped on 3 men strongly associated with the Notorious Gooch Gang after they received a wicked shotgun during a handover on a quiet residential street in broad daylight. Undercover officers watched the handover of the semi-automatic single-barrel shotgun, which occurred on Skye Close in Haywood after 1 PM 2019. They then followed Mr. Waqas Farouk, and then 34-year-old, and then Mr. Zahid Mahood, who was then 30 years old, and Mr. Jamal Chambers, then 24 years old, to Whaley Range, where they struck and recovered the weapon. A judge said Mr. Farouk wanted to acquire the shotgun as part of his drug dealing activities. Now 7 men have been jailed for a total of 65 years in relation to the handover of the weapon. Manchester Crown Court heard that others, including Mr. Tariq Khalik and Mr. Mashek Pennock and Mr. Jordan Starkley, all 28 years old in 2019, had arranged for a man called Mr. Tyrone Keighley Simmons to deliver the weapon and 29 cartridges to Mr. Farouk, Mr. Mahood and Mr. Chambers. As they met in Haywood, Mr. Khalik, who appears to be wearing a black glove, was seen showing Mr. Farouk, Mr. Mahmood and Mr. Chambers the firearm in the holdall, possibly demonstrating how it could be used. The shotgun had been delivered in a large holdall by Mr. Keighley Simmons, who walked over to a field where the cars were parked. Mr. Farouk, Miss Mahmood and Mr. Chambers then drove in tandem down to Brooklyn Avenue in Whaley Range, where they sat in the car and an Audi A3 and thought to be examining the weapon. Minutes later, at about 2:37 PM on October 18th, 2019, armed police struck and arrested the trio. Mr Chambers, who had been there to provide muscle, ran off, but was caught shortly after by police. He was found to have an Armani bag containing heroin. He also had a small knife and about £500 in cash. Mr Farouk also had an Armani bag, which contained digital scales and £710 in cash. At the police station, officers found 5 wraps of cocaine and 5 wraps of heroin stuffed down the front of his trousers. A firearms expert tested the weapon and found that it was in poor condition. Out of 20 to 30 attempts to fire the shotgun, it only discharged twice. One barrister said it was pot luck whether the shotgun would fire or not, but Judge Hillary Manley said the shotgun in this case is a wicked lethal weapon. It matters little that it was in poor condition. The other 4 men were also arrested. In searches of their homes, police found a cannabis farm containing 25 plants at Mr Khalik's property, as well as scales, £1,300 in cash and body armour. Cocaine and cannabis were also found at Mr Keighery Simmons' house, and body armour and a balaclava were also seized at Mr Pinnock's residence. Prosecutor Julian King told the court the prosecution case is that Mr Farouk, Mr Mahmood and Mr Chambers, Mr Khalik and Mr Pinnock are all involved in serious crime, and they are all strongly associated in various ways to the Gooch Gang. But Judge Manley said the evidence showed that it was more likely that they were on the margins of the gang activity rather than the members. In 2009, a judge said members of the Gooch Gang had been involved in crimes reminiscent of Al Capone and Chicago in the era of Prohibition. When firearms fall into the hands of organised criminals, catastrophic harm can be caused. Criminals use firearms to bolster their power, to enforce their threats and criminality, and to further their criminal activities. Mr Farouk, Mr Mahmood and Mr Chambers were all jailed for 11 years. Mr Farouk of Northley Road, Old Trafford, and Mahmood of Linden Avenue, Old Trafford, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to possess a firearm and ammunition with intent to endanger life. Mr Chambers of No Fixed Abode was found guilty of the same offence after a trial. Mr Farouk was also dealt with for possession with intent to supply heroin and cocaine. Mr Chambers for possession with intent to supply heroin and possessing a bladed article, and Mr Mahmood was sentenced for unrelated offences of possession with intent to supply cannabis and dangerous driving. Mr Khalik of Torbay Road, Urmston, was jailed for 10.5 years after admitting conspiracy to possess a firearm and ammunition with intent to endanger life and producing cannabis. Mr Pinnock of Ash Avenue, Cheadle, was jailed for 10 years after pleading guilty to conspiracy to possess a firearm and ammunition with intent to endanger life. Mr Keighery Simmons of Gordon Way, Haywood, and Mr Starkey of Argyle Street, Haywood, both pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply a prohibited firearm. Mr Keighery Simmons also admitted possession with intent to supply of cannabis. He was locked up for 6 years, while Mr Starkey received a sentence of 5.5 years. After the hearing, Detective Sergeant Phil Kennedy of GMP's Serious and Organised Crime Group said that this was an in-depth investigation that has resulted in a lethal weapon and 7 very dangerous individuals being removed from our streets. This gun would have doubtlessly been used to further the criminal aims of those commissioning its use. Seizures of this nature are an invaluable part of our fight against organised crimes. What do you think about the Gooch Gang? Let us know in the comments below.
Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all. And if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe.